We are ready. We're recording.
Let's do it. All right. Welcome to the show. I'm super excited to have with me today in the Deep Track studio, virtual studio, Daren Smith from Craftsman Creative. Welcome, Daren.
Hey, thanks so much, Doug. It is so good to see you.
Yeah, I'm excited. Anyone who's listened to any of my episodes will know that I make a plug for Daren and Craftsman Creative each episode. It's been super helpful, and I can't recommend it enough to everyone out there. So I don't know, should we make more small talk or should we just dive into the questions?
You can always trim out small talk, but
that is true. That is true. All right. And I do want to ask you, I do want to have you talk more about Craftsman Creative. I was thinking we could save that for the end, because kind of my last question I have in mind is kind of related to it anyway. So I thought that would be a good segue. But I figured we could start off with just some background about who you are and where you come from.
Yeah, no, that's good too, because then I have to earn the audience's attention through the episode in order to get to the call to action.
That's right.
So background, let's specifically talk about music background, shall we? So I started listening to jazz music in the womb. My family would attend the Sacramento Jazz Jubilee every Memorial weekend. And so from the time I was literally like in utero to the time I was about 18 when I left for college, every single year I attended the Sacramento Jazz Jubilee. So I grew up listening to jazz music. I played in bands. I played jazz saxophone. So I played alto and tenor sax growing up. And my goodness, I just loved jazz music so much that when I got into high school, I did not listen to alternative music almost at all. So it was a rude awakening and just kind of a blossoming of my musical literacy. When I got to college and people introduced me to like Ben Folds and all other alternative music, I was like, this music's good too. I didn't know. So I really like just listened to jazz throughout all the way up until like when I was 19, I went and left on a 2-year mission for the church and then came back to school at Brigham Young University here in Provo, Utah, where I still live. Yeah. And I went on a saxophone performance scholarship, believe it or not, and was playing in a bunch of bands there and also discovering that there's more to life than just jazz music. And really just that informed like the next steps for me, where I entered my career, where I entered my passions in my adult life. So while I was at university, I got a job doing live sound for all the gigs on campus. So I was running sound for like the Spring Fling and the Fall Fest and the Guitars Unplugged at the Marriott Center. But, you know, as a 20 or 21 year, I guess 21, 22-year-old student, I was running sound in like a 15,000 seat venue at the Marriott Center, which was amazing. And so I loved it. And then got into music.
How did you get that gig to begin with? Like, what was your... Did you just kind of know somebody, or did you, because you didn't have like a lot of background before that, right?
Not in live sound or in sound reinforcement or anything like that. And so I was friends with a guy named Russell Lloyd, and he was friends with the senior audio guy at BYU. And so I hopped in and said, that sounds amazing. I would love to do that. Because at the time I was working at the bowling alley at BYU in the Wilkinson Center, and which was also fun. I got really good at bowling. I was like a 185 average bowler and started a bowling league and all that stuff. Besides the point. So I left that and started doing live sound on campus. And within a year, I was the senior person there because I just loved it. I loved everything about it. And that led to doing live sound here in Provo, Utah, at a venue called Velour Live Music Gallery. Yeah. There was a band called Corey Mon and the Starlight Gospel. I ran sound at the Rex Lee Run, which is like an annual, fun run kind of thing. They were the band that was set up to play at the finish line. And they came up to me afterwards. They're like, dude, you're really good. You should come run sound at Velour. And I was like, what's Velour? Which is silly because Velour is 8 blocks away from campus, but nobody really knew that it existed except for the cool music people.
But I'm kind of curious. Yeah. What was their, what is it that you did that for them was like, oh, he's really good at running sound, like that they approached you on that?
Yeah, I didn't cause any feedback. So that's like step one.
There you go.
To this day, there are still like quote unquote professional sound people that like allow things to feedback. And like you can cause things to feedback intentionally when you're doing sound check, but then they should never feedback after that. So I think they appreciated that they could hear themselves on stage. I knew how to like mix the monitors, and they sounded good in the audience. So they had friends and family that were like, you guys sounded amazing. And they're like, well, we didn't do anything different, so let's go talk to this sound guy. And I think, same age, same kind of like interests and kind of personalities. Like we just jived. My friend Corey, he was, again, the first musician I met in Provo outside of BYU. And we're friends to this day. We go to lunch every other month or so. Like we hang out all the time. So I formed really, lifelong friendships through working at Velour for 10 years. The picture that's here on you can't see my finger, but if you're watching the video of this, and hey, there might be a video of this, this photo that's on my wall is like 30 musicians, and they've all signed their name on their pictures of the 10 years that I worked at this venue. And so I ran sound for bands like Imagine Dragons when they were just starting out and doing Battle of the Bands. I toured and ran sound for bands like Neon Trees, Moth and the Flame, Joshua James, Mindy Gledhill. Like that led to touring, and it led to recording. I'm a recording engineer on one of Mindy Gledhill's albums. I was a member and recording engineer on the Lower Lights albums. Like it just led to this really cool decade or 15 years of having music be a big part of my life. So the story doesn't end there, because that was maybe 5 years ago, and that story ends. Along the way, I expanded music into post-production sound, which I started a post-sound company, and then started a video production company, and then started working full-time as a feature film and TV producer. So that's what I do mostly now when I'm not doing Craftsman Creative stuff. But man, I just gave you a whole mouthful. So like we can dive into any part that you want to. That's the long sordid history of Daren Smith.
Yeah, I do have a lot of I am kind of curious. What are some of the differences in, I'm just trying to think, even if like someone's listening to this and they are interested in getting into sound in some way, right? But they're maybe they haven't even thought like, do I want to do live sound or like work in a studio? For you, do you have preferences, or what are the differences, or are there any that are really significant enough to make it a life decision kind of a thing?
Yeah, man, there's a lot of decisions, and all these decisions played into why I no longer do sound.
Stupid light.
So when I left college, I started my own sound company. It was called Soundsmith Studios, and I had a few routes that I could go. I could do live sound, and I did about 6 months of touring with Neon Trees. I worked at a studio called June Audio, which still exists here in Provo. It's probably the premier studio, and Scott Wiley, the owner, is the premier recording engineer in the state / producer. And then there was post-production sound for film. And so I kind of weighed my options, because I loved all three of these things equally. But I realized that in order to make a career out of this, I kind of had to pick a lane and decide for myself, like, okay, what am I going to become the best at, right? Because I felt at the time that, I was surrounded by a dozen other recording engineers who wanted to work in Utah, and I knew there was not that much recording work in Utah. So I looked at the possibility of doing a recording studio or being a recording engineer, and realized it took lots and lots of money and initial investment. And although today, 15, 20 years later, the equipment's a lot cheaper, there's a lot more digital tools that can do the job. But at the time, I was looking at tens of thousands of dollars worth of investment into microphones and preamps and compressors and sound gear. And then you need a space to record in.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to compete with the best studio in town, because I liked working there and Scott was a friend. And it just felt like that wasn't really the way I wanted to go. And at the time, the only gigs that really were coming in, even for Scott, were like bands that had $500 budgets to record an entire album. Like, well, that does not provide the kind of lifestyle I want. And I saw, like, this is a theme that you'll probably see run through all of my story of my last 20 years. Whenever I see a cap on the potential that I could earn or that I could do, then I kind of don't like that option. So I saw that, like, even the best studios in the world, they charge maybe $250 an hour. But Scott was charging like 75 or 85. Maybe now he charges 100 or 150 an hour. But that's it. Like, you're not charging 1,000 an hour or 500 an hour. And so I saw the cap, and I saw the investment, and I saw, that there wasn't enough demand for more supply, and I didn't want to contribute to that sort of imbalance. So that ruled out
it sounds like he was trying to, I mean, that kind of comes back to like the business model of quantity over quality, right? Like he's just trying to bring in as many artists as possible, right, to try and cover his overhead, as opposed to some studios where they're just looking for a few artists who are a little bit further along in their career. And it sounds like that's almost like what you have to decide as well, is like, am I going to be kind of at the level where artists who are just starting off and, like you said, like a shoestring budget, like they have no money, versus those who are looking for artists who are maybe a little bit further along, they can afford a little bit more. I don't even know where I'm going with this question, but that sounds like that's kind of like part of the decision process though, right? That you're like, okay, where am I going to work with artists? Like what stage of their career and what kind of budget they have?
Yeah. Well, and you might want to work with, the Billboard Top 100 artists, but if you're not in LA or Nashville or New York, you're probably not going to, unless you've got some sort of compound, some place that's really cool, where it's like, what you see that thing Taylor Swift had, where she just like built a, woodland forest recording studio and then invited people out and they were drinking drinks at the campfire outside. It's like, okay, but you could do that, but you have to be a world renowned producer or engineer in order to have that sort of thing. It all comes down to that balance of supply and demand. So just to quickly get through the rest of this answer, I also looked at touring, and I did that for 6 months with Neon Trees. We did a national tour on their first album, and it was amazing. It was an incredible opportunity. I saw that there was potential to be making, 10, 12, 15 grand a month, but that was kind of the cap. And I'm like, okay, that's a lot for right where I'm at right now, but like maybe in the future, I don't want to be on the road 11 months out of the year and limited to what I can make and what I can do. I like variety. I like being able to do different things every day. And so it was right around the time, April, my wife was pregnant with our first son, Eli. I was out for 6 months and came back, and he was due in the next like month or two. I think I even did a gig, like a one-off county fair type thing in Louisiana or something, like 2 weeks before he was born. And they came to me, Neon Trees came to me and said, hey, we're going to do another tour, and we want you to come be our sound guy again. I was like, that's amazing. What does that look like? They're like, well, we're literally going to be gone 10 out of the next 11 months. I was like, but my son's going to be born in 2 weeks. Like that was not the way I wanted my first son's first year of life to be, like no dad around. Plus it seemed unfair to April. Plus I really like her. She's my favorite person. So I want to be around her more than this band.
Right.
And they were great people, but I had to turn it down. And I was just like, guys, that's not the lifestyle I want. So turn that down. And that really just narrowed it down to, okay, post-production sound is what I'm going to dive into. And over the next few years, I, doubled my hourly rate. I became one of the top, probably 3 people in the state as far as post-production sound goes. I did a dozen movies, basically by myself or with a small team, and really became known as like a very in-demand sound engineer. So I went from making 25 an hour when I started, or 20 an hour when I started, to like 2 years later, I was charging 75 to 100 an hour for the same work, because I chose a lane and I said, this is what I'm going to do. But then I bumped up against that same ceiling of, oh, there's only so much I can charge. Oh, there's only so much work. That's when I partnered with another partner who was a director and editor. We formed a video production company, and that's where I started becoming a producer. And that's where I really loved just the vibe of like, I can do anything. There's unlimited budgets, there's unlimited potential, unlimited reach. Every project's different. And that's really where I found my groove career-wise.
Yeah. Well, and now you're doing, I mean, this is like completely different than sound stuff, what you're doing now, right? I mean, like, actually just lay out what is the difference what you're doing now with production work, because it's a completely different field, completely different lane. Like, is there anything, like, how do you make that jump? I know you were initially kind of doing sound on like movies and shows, but then somewhere along the way you saw like, okay, I want to start doing producing, and then you're a producer, right? And so I don't know, how did you make that jump, and what's the difference now? Like how are things different for you now with what you were doing before?
Well, that's a big question. You probably didn't know that, but that's a big question. So let me answer the first one because it's probably most applicable to people listening, right? Which is everybody knew me as a sound person. They knew me as a sound engineer and they knew me as a movie sound guy. And in order to fully become a producer, I had to change my identity, not just personally, but in the minds of hundreds of people who knew me as a sound person. And so for about 2 years, probably took about 2.5 years, where people would call me and say, "Hey, I got a gig. I'm looking, I would love to have you do it and grab a sound system and set it up." And I was like, I don't do sound anymore. And it was hard because that was work and that was income. But I knew that if people forever saw me as a sound person who also does movies, then I would never make it in the industry. I would never be able to break out as a producer. And so there were literally like 2, maybe 3 people that I would say yes to. Ryan Innes was one of them. And to this day, if he called me tomorrow and said, "Hey, I got a gig this week and I need you to run sound," I would call my dozen contacts and say, "Who has a sound system?" And I would figure it out. The other person that I say yes to is Corey Fox. He's the owner of Velour. Like last year when they reopened after the pandemic, was it last year or 2021? I think it was last year.
Yeah.
He had 2 shows and they were kind of bigger shows. And he called me. I hadn't done sound there in like 2 years. They had a brand new board I'd never used. Like, it was just like, okay, I'm going to come in at 2 instead of my normal time an hour before. I'm going to come in 4 hours before so I can make sure it's going to be good. And I ran sound for 2 nights in a row at Velour last summer. So those are really like the 2 people who can call me and get a yes. Everybody else, I'm just like, I don't do that anymore. I turned down a filming job last month for the same reason. I don't do like guy with a camera filming anymore. I'm a producer. Producers don't hold the camera. That's not my job.
That's so like the last scene in Gattaca where he's like, "How did you win?" When they're like swimming out into the ocean. He's like, "I didn't save anything for the swim back." That's you. You're like, "I'm saving nothing for the swim back."
That's a very apt analogy. Yeah, I cut off the person I was in order to become the person I wanted to be. And so if you're finding yourself in the same situation, listening or watching to this, like, and you're going, "Man, do I want to be a musician or a producer or a this or a this?" Like, there are a few people that have managed to do all of the things. Scott Wiley is a good example. He's a musician, he's a producer, he's an engineer, and he's like world class at all of them. But there's one of those in the entire state of Utah, right? Everybody else is like, either if you choose to do 2 or 3 things, you're like an okay bass player and an okay engineer and an okay producer. Yeah. And no one's coming to you for the thing. You're never growing your demand. And so you can never increase your prices. And so a decade later, you're still doing the same gigs with the same people. Maybe that works for a lot of people. There's nothing wrong with that. For me and my personality, I needed that progress and that growth day after day, week after week, year after year, in order to feel alive, in order to feel fulfilled. So I knew that I had to kind of cut off the sound guy and, disavow Soundsmith Studios and become, Daren Smith, the producer.
Yeah. For those listening who don't know, Daren actually used to be a woman. He completely changed his identity, totally, all the way. So, are you happy now? I mean, do you feel like this is the right trajectory? Like everything was the right. Actually, I guess if you weren't happy, that'd be like a bad question to ask. You start break down crying in the.
Doug, I'm so sad. Every day I wake up sad.
What was I thinking? I saved nothing for the swim back.
Yeah, no, I'm extremely happy and fulfilled every single day. And we haven't even got to the Craftsman Creative bit yet, but now I've added that to the mix, right? So I do this producing thing, and then the thing I loved when I was in between feature film projects was going to lunch with my musician and artist friends and talking business because they didn't know how to do it. And I was over here building 6-figure businesses since, from the time of the pandemic. I built 3 6-figure businesses. And people were like, "What are you doing? And how do you do this?" And blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, I can teach this. I love teaching and talking to people and going to lunch. And it started with that. So now I have this other business called Craftsman Creative, which literally is, it exists to help artists and creators and musicians and filmmakers and all types of creative people build what I call bespoke creative businesses that allow them to do their creative work full time. So I get a ton of fulfillment from that too. And If at some point, a year or 10 or whatever from now, I'm not fulfilled as much as I think I could be, then I'll add something else to the mix, or I'll stop doing this other thing and I'll do something else, because that's how I like to live my life. So yeah, I think joy and fulfillment are paramount, and really what I optimize my life around. Like, I need a certain amount of financial freedom in order to feel fulfilled and happy and be in a position to pursue these different things. But once that's in place, it's like, okay, what really gives me the most, fulfillment, and like fills my cup and makes me feel like I'm leaving a mark on the world or doing good things or creating leverage where I can help lots and lots of people. Like, those are the things that really excite me.
Yeah, and it seems like, I mean, for as long as I've known you, I mean, you've definitely never been short on ideas, right? Like you never, what's that saying? You never let the grass grow under your feet, or however the saying goes. But I definitely, I see in you too, like you enjoy just the creative process. Like it's not even like, obviously not specific to any kind of medium or lane or whatever, right? But it just seems like just the creative process overall is something that fascinates you, and you like to jump in and just kind of roll up your sleeves and get like whatever the project is that somebody's working on. You have like ideas of just how to take that and kind of move to the next level, or to do something with it, right? I think for a lot of creatives, myself in particular, we kind of hover in this realm of big ideas and no implementation. But you're definitely an implementation guy. I always think about like going over to your house and seeing on your piano like the lead sheets for it was like some jazz tunes.
Fly
I
Me
can't
to the
remember.
Moon, probably.
Yeah, and it's funny, and I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you had played piano. And you're like, well, I just decided I want to learn how to play jazz piano. Right? And I was like, yeah, that's very Daren. It's like you wake up one morning, you're like, I want to do this. All right, I'm gonna do it. It's not just talk. But all right, well, I had another question that I feel like is kind of a good one for, I'm hoping, for my podcast, and it's kind of along the lines of, it seems like artists nowadays, well, okay, in this new world we are in, it's not so much about the big audience or the big like the big audience, the big clientele, right? But everyone's kind of picking their niche that they're going to focus on. Like, this is what, I mean, because there's enough people, there's enough stuff out there, right, that you can kind of say like, this is what I'm going to do, and you're focusing on kind of your local or your virtual audience. So like for musicians nowadays, or performers who are trying to get a band off the ground, or get like some kind of performance career off the ground, what would you say is, because you've worked with a lot of like local talent, and then also talent that's not so local, right? Like you talk about Neon Trees and Imagine Dragons. So there's some differences. So I mean, what is it like now for local artists? Like, what do they have to do now to get their career off the ground?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I love it, because I've spent a lot of the last probably 6 months really diving into how does that work for an individual or a small group of 3 to 5 people. How do you create a career out of this thing where it doesn't fizzle out because you gave it your all in your early 20s, but then everybody got married and then got jobs, and now they're moving across country to pursue their careers, and the band never went anywhere. Like, if you look at this poster on my wall, this collection of photos, 80% of the musicians on that don't play music anymore. And that's why it's on my wall, because I want a future that exists with lots and lots of art and music in it, not one that's completely, everything's generated by AI and run by big, massive companies, right? That's not interesting to me.
It's a scary new world. Yeah.
I've never had an AI make me feel something, right? So that's why we rely on art, and why we turn to art in moments where we need it. So let me try to give the short answer. The short answer is that you can look for a minimum viable audience that can support your creative work. People have written about this. There's a gentleman named Kevin Kelly. He's kind of a techno-futurist. He's the co-founder of Wired magazine, and just is an amazing. He's like the world's most interesting man, like incarnate. But he wrote this article called "1,000 True Fans," and basically the gist of that is that if you can find 1,000 people who are willing to give you $100 a year for your art, whether it's going to shows, buying your merch, buying tickets, buying your music, whatever it might be, supporting you on Patreon, then you only need 1,000 of those at $100 a year to have a 6-figure revenue stream, right?
Yeah.
And, the numbers are starting to get a little bit old. It's probably a 10 or 15-year-old article. So maybe the new number is 120 or 150, but still you need 1,200 or 1,500 people.
Right.
But in that context, I always ask, the very first question I ask is, what's the outcome? What is it that you're really after? Because some musicians will say, I really want to make a lot of money from my music, but I don't want to tour. I would rather not have fan bases at all. It's like, okay, well, maybe you need to get into licensing, or you need to get into songwriting, or you need to get into music composition, or whatever it might be, because those people are not necessarily famous, but there are plenty that make 6 and 7 figures a year doing that kind of work at a high level. So what's the outcome? If the outcome is I want to tour the world and make enough, for not just me, but my 4 bandmates and my crew of 10 people, it's like, okay, well, you need to be Neon Trees at the very low end and Imagine Dragons. I apologize that I said that, because they're both very talented groups of musicians. No group is better than the other, but Imagine Dragons' fan base is massive, right? They're one of the biggest bands on the planet the last decade. So yeah, they have to make millions of dollars a year from their touring and their music streaming and their licensing and everything in order to support that apparatus. Yeah. So what's the outcome? Because unless you know what the outcome is, you can't you can't align your daily actions to get to a destination. And so if you know what the outcome is, say, for example, that the outcome is, I really love writing what I want to write, when I want to write it. It's not necessarily for anybody. It just gives me fulfillment. And it would be great to make a little bit of extra money on it. Okay, then you're probably not going to build a business that's going to make 6 figures a year, right? Because there's no real structure to it and there's whatever. But you can still optimize your quote unquote business to get you that outcome. You have freedom of time, freedom of location, freedom of creativity. You have all the things that you really were set out to get, and you're massively fulfilled. And the last thing you want is to be touring the world, 150 dates a year and never seeing your family, right?
Yeah.
So one person's outcome doesn't necessarily make it your outcome. You got to figure out what it is for you first. And then it's about systematically going after that in a direct way if possible. And that's kind of what I built Craftsman Creative for, is to say, okay, instead of you taking 10 years to figure out what that direct path is, I've already got it. Here it is. Come here and I'll help you walk that path.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like it's, artists these days it's different even than just like 5-10 years ago, with the traditional model of you create a product and you're just kind of looking for an agent or a manager or someone who's going to kind of, but nowadays it feels like you have to kind of almost become your own manager, your own agent, because there are so many, there's just so many things out there that are vehicles for people to be able to access, which is great. It's like, there's never been there's never been more avenues for people to be able to get their art or their creations out there into the world, right? But it also kind of puts it back on the artist to wear more than one hat, right? If they really want to make it happen, they have to kind of learn how these things work, and they really have to learn the business. And it's not just, like I said, like you're just kind of this talent who just finds some guy, who's going to plug it for you, but you have to just figure out, okay. But yeah, that's where like things like Craftsman Creative, this interview is definitely like an elongated commercial, but that's okay, because
why do you think I came?
And I can't say enough good things about it anyway. But yeah, like it's just things like that are going to be the vehicle for you. It's a different realm, with even things like SoundCloud or just Spotify or just these different avenues for being able to reach an audience in some way that no one's ever had before. And so it's beautiful. It's great. But it's also like, okay, it's not how things used to be. You have to kind of learn a few new things, a few new tricks if you want to be able to make this happen. And I like that, what your point as well, just you have to have your end goal in mind. Like, what do I really want to accomplish with this, or where do I want to go with this? And until you kind of figure that out, you're sort of spinning your wheels. Are there any things you do that in you're one of the most goal-driven people I've ever known. Is there anything you do that kind of helps you stay on that path, that whatever goal you have set up for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, the vision and the long-term thinking and the outcome-focused approach is very much central to what Craftsman Creative is and what it teaches. The term craftsman mindset comes from a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. And it talks about it's not just pursuing your passion. That really won't get you what you want. You have to have this outcome-focused approach. And so I kind of built the whole business around that because it was a very impactful book that came right around the time that I was shifting from sound to producing. But there's a few things I wanted to bring up. One is I wrote this as a chapter of my book, which is called the three personas that every business needs. And it's true even if you're a company of one. You have to have an entrepreneur, you have to have a manager, and you have to have an artist. And if you only ever live, if you spend 99 or 100% of your time as the artist, then you're never making any progress because you're not optimizing and maximizing and figuring out what's working as a manager. And you're never thinking big. You're never looking at what's my outcome or what's my big vision or what's the goal for the next 3, 5, 10 years because you don't shift into that entrepreneur mindset. And so at strategic times, you have to really just literally put on a different hat and go, okay, I'm not going to be artist for the next hour. I'm going to be a manager. I'm going to do my taxes. I'm going to do my finances. I'm going to send 20 emails and I'm going to, manage a couple of systems that aren't working as well. And then once a month or once a week, you're going to step into that entrepreneur hat and go, okay, what were my big goals and how am I going to accomplish those this month? And what are the big milestones and all those things? And the people that can figure out how to do that are the ones that progress and can get those big outcomes. Whereas the thing that I constantly see is my artistic friends who have been doing music or art or filmmaking for 5, 10, 15 years, and they're still making 60, 70 grand a year. They still have the same type of work, the same type of jobs, the same number of days that they get on set or number of gigs, and they haven't progressed at all. And that's really hard because most creatives that I've met are driven by a need to contribute, to share their art, to make the world a better place, and to grow and progress. They want to get better at their craft. They want to grow their size of their audience. They want more people showing up every week. We had a friend who came back after 12 years and played at Velour, and the room was 25 people. And the last time I saw him there, it was 250 and it was sold out, and they had to add a second night. That can't feel good, right?
No.
But he hadn't done anything over those 10 years to engage that audience and to et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. But to answer your question, there's a concept that I've recently spent a lot of time researching and figuring out and thinking through for my business and for those that I help. How do you apply this? How do you get it to show up in your business? And the concept is one called oversubscribed. There's a book by the same name written by a guy named Daniel Priestley. And it's the subtitle, I think, is How to Get People Lining Up to Do Business with You. And so that's in every business, but specifically in artist-driven businesses like musicians or filmmakers. If we have infinite supply because our music is digital and it doesn't cost anything to reproduce another copy or have another person stream it or watch it or listen to it, then we always have this imbalance between supply and demand. There's always more supply than there is demand. And so that makes it near impossible to grow your audience or raise your rates or charge more, especially when you're reliant on platforms. And so the idea of being like, oh, well, I would rather charge $5 per stream than 0.00005 cents per stream on Spotify. You can't do that because you don't own the algorithm. You can't go in and change the pricing model of how it pays out. So you're reliant on these big, massive platforms like Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Spotify to grow your revenue. And the problem is they make more money the more people they onboard and turn into creators on their platform. So Instagram is looking to have hundreds and thousands of new creators on the platform every single day posting more stuff. Same with YouTube, same with Spotify, because the more they make, the more audience that they're going to bring in. And since they take whatever it is, 90% of what revenue, they're going to make more money the more people they bring on. So that's bad for you, because if you are one of the billion or whatever people on Spotify, it's just going to progressively get less and less because their overhead at Spotify is going to increase because there's more artists they have to support and more listeners that they have to make sure the experience is good for. And granted, they do a good job, but nobody that I know makes money from Spotify. I think
Unless
the
they
bands
do
that have even done
stream farming or whatever they call it, right? Where
oh
the people like,
gosh, yeah, I don't know. So how do you do this? Well, it's thinking small. It's thinking about the audience as individuals and going, okay, how can I increase the value of my offer or offers for the individual that really cares? Because the casual listener that listens to one song one time on Spotify is not your ideal customer. The super fan who comes to every single show, owns 3 of your shirts, has physical copies of the LPs of your, like the vinyl version of your albums that you did in a limited release, that person who spent $100 or $150 or $200 on your business this year, how do you turn that one into 10, into 100, into 1,000? That's
yeah,
the
what was
answer.
it? Like your interview on your podcast with Brian, what's his name? He called them his maniacs, his 2000 maniacs or something like that, right?
Yeah, Brian Clark.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's probably more the number now. It's like more like 2,000 than 1,000. But it's thinking about that. It's how can you get more? It's like, don't think of it as like as a businessman, like an economist, like, monopoly type character, right? Where you're like, how can I get more money out of every single person? It's
Right.
not that, but it's how can I add more value so that it's worth more? So instead of just doing shows where you're doing $10 a pop and you've got 100 people showing up so you can make $500 after you're split with the venue, how can you make that a $50 experience? How could you get in front of 2,500 people? How can you do it five nights a month instead of one? Like, these are questions that you could ask, and those could lead to interesting answers to where all of a sudden you're not just making $500 a month, you're making $5,000 or 50 grand.
Yeah.
Instead of just doing it for your audience for $10 a pop or $50 a pop, what if you did it for a company at one of their events for $5,000 and you did 4 of those a month? Well, that's 20 grand a month. So all of a sudden it's the same offer. It's, I'm going to perform my music for you, just in 4 or 5 different contexts. And then you got to really just rationalize or think through, like, okay, how does that align with the business I want to have and the outcomes that I've set for myself? Because if one of your outcomes is, I don't ever want to do corporate gigs, it's like, okay, well, you're probably going to be limited in how much money you can make. Well, I don't ever want to license my music because it degrades the art. Well, you're probably going to be limited in how much money you can make. But if one of your outcomes is, I want to be doing 500,000 a year for this band so that all 4 of us and our manager can make 6-figure salaries. Okay, first of all, you probably need more than 500K for that, but let's just easy math. So let's say you need to make 500K a year. Well, that's 10 grand a month, or sorry, 10 grand a week. How are you going to do that? It's probably not going to be from Spotify. I don't even think the Taylor Swifts of the world or the whatevers of the world make 10 grand a week from Spotify. I don't know. Maybe they do, but I don't think they're churning out millionaires over there. I think it's like the 0.03% that are making more than $1 million a year from their streaming revenue. So that's not the answer. So the answer is, don't try to go broad and don't try to increase supply. The opposite option is to increase demand, right? You have to figure out how to get those things in balance, where you've got limited offers and you've got high ticket offers and you've got high value offers that you can put in front of people and say, look, there's one of these this year. Maybe you are only going to license your song twice, and you can say that on your website, like, this new hit song that is on the radio, we're only going to license it twice. So it costs $50,000, but you've never licensed anything for more than $1,000 before. Well, look, you just took control of the reins there. And you said, I'm going to be in charge or be in control of that balance between supply and demand. Just by saying, I'm going to do it twice or once, you made 50 instead of trying to get 50 people to give you 1,000.
Yeah.
So that's such a big thing that I've been focused a lot on over the last 6 months or 12 months, is like, how do I do that for my businesses, which are like digital product based? And it led me to creating new offers, and it led me to rethink how I'm involved in the film world, where I'm not just a vendor anymore. I'm a partner. Like, it costs a lot more to hire me as a, gun for hire producer now than it did 2 years ago on my first movie, because I don't want to just be a vendor trading time for dollars. That's like not as high leverage as it could be. So the next thing I'm doing is going and raising a fund, because I want to be in control of the supply and demand. right? I want to basically become unhireable, where you can't hire me. You can only work with me if you're an investor, and I am the one who hires everybody. I'm shifting the balance between supply and demand by doing that. So it's a little bit of like economics and a little bit of business thinking, but that's, I think, what is required for artists to make a full-time living doing what they love. It's to have a little bit of that mindset of a business owner integrated in their artist lifestyle.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think that, and it never hurts to also just surround yourself with people who can kind of either wear those hats, if not for you, but at least help you. I mean, like that Clint Eastwood line, like a man's got to know his limitations, and I know, like, I definitely know where my limitations are, right? So that's where I'm like, okay, I need to have somebody who can help me with this side of things, because like I'm okay with the content. Like that's obviously why I do what I do, because I'm passionate about it and I have experience in it and education. But here's the things where I'm weak in. And so, like I'll kind of wear my hat in those areas as far as I can, and then recognize like, okay, I need to bring in some kind of help in this regard of this, right? So identifying a community or of people that you can surround you with, or just networking, which that's something I hate doing. Like I'm not shy at all, but I'm kind of an introvert, so I tend to like avoid human contact rather than seek it. So that's like always been my big issue, is like, okay, I got to really do more networking with people and talk to people and connect with people. But it's true. You got to bring people in your life who are going to help you kind of maximize those parts of what maybe you're weak, right? And kind of help fill that gap that you need to help fill. I want to link in the show notes these books that you mentioned in these articles. So I'll have to hit you up for that, or go back through and re-listen to everything you've mentioned. Maybe two more questions.
I'll try to keep my answers shorter now.
Well, this is
I can go all day long on these things, man. I love talking about this stuff.
I know. Well, honestly, I've been like, I mean, some of this stuff we've discussed before as well, but I'm like kind of also like mentally taking notes. I'm like, oh, this is good stuff for my own creative business. But something I've been thinking about since the beginning of the podcast, or sorry, beginning of this episode, is name maybe your top 3 favorite jazz artists.
Oh, they're all going to be saxophone players. That's the problem.
Most of mine are piano players.
So I'll keep it easy and just do that. Cannonball Adderley be my favorite. Okay. Then Charlie Parker, and then John Coltrane.
Wow. Most people would put Coltrane at the top, but I think that's just because he's such a big name.
Well, I think you don't have Coltrane unless you had Charlie Parker.
That's true.
And I just like playing Cannonball Adderley music more than I like Charlie Parker music. It feels a little bit more controlled and intentional, whereas Charlie Parker feels a little bit frantic at times. Not to say that you shouldn't listen to it, that's not good. But like if I'm going to turn on one of those 3, I'm usually turning on Cannonball Adderley.
Oh, cool.
And listening to Stars Fell on Alabama or something like that, right? Or Limehouse Blues. So those are it for me. Like I can definitely listen to Miles Davis. The John Mayer Trio album that he did like has a lot of great blues and great, like, was it Steve Jordan on drums? And I forget who the bass player was, but my gosh, like if you listen to that on a good sound system, you're just like, that's artistry recorded right there. Like that's insane. Nice. So to think of a more recent one, like John Mayer's freaking really good blues guitar player.
I feel like I always feel like I haven't listened enough to, he's one of those artists that come up a lot where I'm like, man, like I don't listen to him very often. But like he just comes up so often. It's like, oh, he's a great artist for this or for this or for this. And then whenever I do listen to him, I'm like, yeah, he actually really is good.
Yeah. I'll put Nora Jones in the mix too.
Oh, okay.
As a more modern one, because I feel like she did some interesting stuff piano wise with her first album. That was just like, what's going on there? And you realize she's playing left hand an octave low, and you're like, oh, that's different. So that one just kind of hit me really nice. I love kind of like the, Sinatra, generations that descended from Sinatra. So I love like the Michael Bublé's of the world and stuff too. Like I kind of put that a little bit in the jazz world. But yeah, I mean, really those that were in the 50s and 60s that just have my heart. You know?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. There's like definitely during the 60s, there's like this generation of artists in the jazz world that just, I feel like if I could ever go back and do another, well, let's see how Deep Tracks, how well it does. Because if I could ever go back and like, okay, if I want to do another music history podcast, I think jazz history would be really fun. A lot of great stories there as well. Like just all the figures are just very fascinating. Fascinating lives. So my last question, I got this idea actually from my daughter who listened to this other podcast. I can't remember the name of it. I wish I could, but he something he does is he asks each of his guests one question that they want the next guest that's interviewed. So is there any question you have that you want me to ask the next guest that I interview? I don't know who that is yet, but
yeah. What is the moment that you knew that music was going to be what your life was about?
Nice. All right, that's a good question. We'll see who I get on next. Maybe it'll be like someone huge, you know, like Lars Ulrich, the drummer for Metallica. Right. All right, cool. Oh my gosh, my ring light's falling over again. I think that's the signal that this is good. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for helping me realize that my whole workspace is not really set up very well for video. I have to revamp my little recording studio here.
I'm here to help.
Yeah, that's right. And that's Daren Smith, everyone, the man who puts man in craftsman. I don't know. I'll work on that tagline.
He puts the man in craftsman.
Yeah.
And the creative and creative.
There we go. Yeah. All right. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it. And yeah, any sign off you want to give everyone as we head out?
Yeah. If anything I mentioned today resonated, go to craftsmancreative.co, check out my book. You can actually read it for free there. And I've got a whole bunch of ways that I can support you as a creative individual who's seeking to do this work full time. So come connect with me over there, shoot me a message, follow me on Twitter, whatever it's easy for you. But like, I'm here to help. So I love getting messages from people that heard me on a podcast and have become a coaching client or become, a consulting client or whatever it might be, because it means that what I said online resonated and that I'm, able to help them, or at least they feel like I can help them. But usually it works out pretty well.
Well, that's right. And I should mention, that you also have a podcast. I know you're on the Joe Pulizzi, but then you have your own as well, right?
Yeah, I just kickstarted it again. I'd been dark since like June of last year because I went and did a movie overseas over the summer. So I wasn't recording any episodes. And then when I was out there, I pitched Joe Pulizzi from The Tilt on doing a podcast together called the 10K Creators. So that's a great like starting point to kind of get a little bit more context around kind of my outlook on creative work, and also Joe's mixed in there. And so that's 10kcreatorshow.com. And then if you just go to podcast.craftsmancreative.co, that's mine. I've just started, like literally yesterday, posted the first new episode. And I'm just basically sharing 3 ideas every Friday to help you with your creative business. And so yesterday was 3 ideas around sales. I realized after doing an event the last few weeks that was the area most creators and artists struggled with, was sales. That was like out of 100%, they got 27% on average when it came to sales. Everything else was, 40, 50%. And so I was like, all right, we need to talk about sales. So we did a lot of posts in the community this week. And then I took those posts and picked 3 of them and turned them into a podcast. So that's that. You can get it over at podcast.craftsmancreative.co.
Cool. And I'll definitely link that as well as and the Joe Pulizzi. Lots of links in the show notes for this episode.
Lots of links. That's how we like it.
Yes. Yeah. Lots of rabbit holes. All right. Well, thank you, my friend. Appreciate your time. And it's always good talking to you.
Yeah. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Thanks. You too.